it's great to be with you. And thanks for that introduction, Lucy and Tashana. I'm a marine ecologist by background, and I've got involved in carbon assessments, but also carbon marketing and financing, really for very pragmatic reasons, which is I have been working for many years in a range of coastal ecosystems, and I was watching these ecosystems being destroyed. In the case of mangroves, at a rate of around 2% or just under per year in Kenya, especially. And it was clear that the approaches that we were taking, the conservation approaches we were taking, were not sufficient to help protect these habitats. So that was the motivation. And I guess our theory of change, for many scientists like me, we felt our job really was to try to describe technically the problems, to publish papers, and then to wait for somebody else to solve those problems, some decision maker, some politician, some policy maker. And as a theory of change, that really didn't work, or it doesn't work. It's certainly not in Kenya and in many of the countries that I've had the privilege to work in. So that's why I got involved in carbon. And I thought it might be helpful for you today to just talk through, first of all, the background, the reason why, from a scientific perspective, and particularly from a climate change, climate mitigation and adaptation perspective, we're interested in these coastal ecosystems. Secondly, to give you a little bit of a case study, learning from the lessons that we've learned from, particularly from Mikoko Pamoja, which is the project that Lucy mentioned, Mangroves Together in Kenya. Also another project in Kenya called Vanga Blue Forest. And then to reflect at the end on some of the challenges involved in this kind of commodification and sale of blue carbon, and some of the technical challenges, but also the political and the ethical issues that it raises. And one of the fun things about working in this area is that it's so interdisciplinary that nobody is an expert. So my expertise, my disciplinary expertise is in biology and in ecology, but I've had to find myself working with people from all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of expertise, bringing all sorts of expertise, which means that we're putting it together as we go. But our experience is that it can work for conservation and for people. So if I could have the next slide, please. Just to talk on the big picture briefly, human beings are dumping 11.5 gigatons, that's 11.5 billion million tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. That's a lot of carbon. In fact, it's a little bit more than that. You can see these data were from 2020. So that's the big picture. Most of that, as you know, comes from burning of fossil fuels. Around 15% of it comes from land use change, particularly deforestation. Next slide, just click, please. And one of the, I suppose, exciting things about climate science is a depressing area to work in because of its implications for us all, but it also involves some really wonderful and fascinating science. One of the things that we know is that only around 50% of that carbon stays in the atmosphere after we emit it. So if you click again, you'll see that just over half of that carbon that disappears from the atmosphere goes into land-based sinks. If you click, please. And then if we click again, you'll see that there's the other half, just under the half, goes into the oceans. So you can see that. If you click, you'll see that going into the ocean. And most of that oceanic carbon is dissolved in the seawater. That's not the same as a carbon. Well, some people refer to that as a carbon sink. I do not, because mainly because that's a regrettable, that's a negative consequence. It's what's driving ocean acidification. So the point of this slide is to point out that natural carbon sinks, the forests and the oceans, absorb around 50% of all the carbon that we put into the atmosphere every year. And without those sinks, climate change would be running many times faster than it is already. Next slide, please. So when we think about the options for meeting the Paris Agreement goals, Paris Agreement signed in 2015, and the governments of the world, as you know, came together and committed to attempting to restrain temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. That goal cannot now be met, but I think we should still aspire to bringing temperature back down to 1.5 degrees as quickly as we can. For sure, it's going to exceed that now. In 2018, the IPCC produced a really important report that looked at the feasible pathways that could lead us to a 1.5 degree future. There were roughly four families of scenarios, and what we're looking at here is the P1 family of scenarios on that report. And you can see, first of all, and most obviously, P1 requires a really rapid reduction in emissions, which we're not seeing, unfortunately, in the world at the moment. But you can also see some interesting brown shading in that diagram. And by 2060, we are in net negative zone for that scenario. In other words, the world is absorbing more carbon dioxide than human beings are releasing into the atmosphere. That's why the green line goes below the axis there. If you click, please, what that implies, the brown shading there is forest. It's natural carbon sinks. So this scenario, the IPCC scenario, suggests that in order to reach net zero, in fact, net negative, we need a massive expansion in nature-based solutions, in carbon sinks, natural carbon sinks. This is particularly forests on land, but it's not only terrestrial forests. The reason I'm talking about scenario 1 is that it's the only scenario there, P1, that does not involve new technology. So all the other scenarios that involve less steep declines and perhaps less expansion of forests, all of them involve new technology, which we don't have. So it's by far the best scenario. Next slide, please. So when we think a bit more about the oceans, we've got mangroves, we've got seagrass, we've also got salt marshes. Those three habitats are the so-called blue carbon habitats, the traditional ones. And I'll explain why those are so important shortly. The big picture in the ocean is that there's a lot of carbon absorbed into the ocean. So that figure there, 1,000, that's roughly the amount of gigatons, billions of tons, that are dissolved in the upper surface of the ocean. And you can see that carbon's fluxing out of the ocean, 70 gigatons a year, and it's fluxing in 72. So that's the extra carbon that we're putting into the ocean every year, those two gigatons. Next click, please. Carbon moves into the deeper ocean as well, as you can see there. And next click, please. Some of that carbon is absorbed by green plants, by phytoplankton. And if you click, you'll see that those green plants can sink to the bottom of the ocean. So that's a form of carbon sequestration. Some of that carbon goes to the bottom of the ocean. And the next click, you'll see we estimate about 0.2 gigatons across the whole of the ocean is buried in the bottom every year, the bottom of the ocean. That 0.2, that black stuff at the bottom, will go on, if we leave it alone, it will go on to become oil in millions of years' time. So the whole of the ocean sequesters 0.2 gigatons organic carbon every year. If we look at the mangroves, the coastal area, mangroves sequester more than a tenth of that. Now, mangroves are a tiny fraction of the area of the ocean, but they're responsible for up to 15% of all the organic carbon that's buried in the ocean every year. So that tells you that they're extremely powerful natural carbon sinks. Next slide, please. And the seagrass are in there too. The seagrass are also really powerful. And that, in fact, they're a bit more important globally because they're a much bigger area than mangroves. Next slide, please. So I've made the case for mangroves and seagrass, and up here in the temperate regions, saltgrass, salt marshes too. And that's because they're very, very powerful natural carbon sinks. That means there's a lot of carbon per unit area in these sinks. And we've developed over the years, we've developed all sorts of expertise in restoring mangroves and these ecosystems when they've been damaged. So you can see on the top of that slide, one of the sites that we worked for many years in Kenya. You can see the stumps there. This is a former forest that was destroyed for industrial purposes. And we can restore that through planting, as the woman there is doing. And eventually we can come back to a natural forest. So that kind of process is very exciting, and it brings back not just carbon, of course, but a healthy forest. What would happen if we did that across the world? Well, the best estimate of total potential across the world, if we restored all these blue carbon sites like mangroves and seagrass, is about 840 million tons of CO2 per year. That's really good. That's a really big number. But if you click the next click, we should remind ourselves that although that's a big number, it's only 3% of global anthropogenic human-created emissions. So I'm raising that straight at the start. Lucy mentioned it's important for us to have a realistic idea of what we can achieve with blue carbon and with the restoration of these ecosystems. They're really important. They're extremely powerful, probably amongst the most powerful of all natural carbon sinks. But because human beings are putting so much carbon into the atmosphere, they are not a solution to climate change and to rapid climate crisis. They are a contribution, and yeah, perhaps up to 3% of the contribution. Thank you. Next slide, please. That's the big picture. Zooming down now, I'm going to take you to southern Kenya, where I've worked for the last over 2 decades now, and just 2 sites in Kenya. And these are fantastic, beautiful tropical sites. They've got mangroves, they've got coral reefs, they've got seagrass, and they've also got people. So one of the features, as you know, of most mangrove ecosystems across the world, not all, but most, is that people are very intimately involved with these systems. So the local communities here have, most of them, there are migrants, new people there too, but they have long traditions of working in these areas and living with these mangroves. And of course, that involves knowledge of how to manage and sustainably exploit their ecosystems. Next slide, please. This is some work that I did with Lucy, and she taught me a lot about economics. One of the things we did with the Ghazi forest there was to try and work out what the theoretical values of the different services that the mangroves there provide for the globe, but also for local people. And you can see that theoretically, the most important value from an economic point of view of the forest is the protection of the coastline against erosion. That was a really important, and you can work it out by working out how quickly the coastline without mangroves is eroding and the value of the land that is being lost as a result of that. So looking at these kind of data, you would think, well, why would carbon looks important, but carbon isn't the most valuable service that these forests are providing for people. Surely we should try and focus on erosion. The challenge of that is that nobody is paying to prevent erosion. So the reason we focus on carbon out of all of these great services that the forest provides is because there is a market for carbon, and we can go and sell the benefits of carbon sequestration on an international market. That doesn't mean that these other services are not important. In fact, they're critically important. Fisheries people, that's literally life or death, of course, for those people, many people in the local communities who rely very directly on fish. But the point is that nobody is paying for those services, and there is a market for carbon. Next slide, please. So that was the reason we focused on carbon. And if you're interested in developing a project like this, one of the questions that you ask, first of all, is what kind of carbon standard am I going to use, or do I use a carbon standard at all? Carbon standards are third-party independent bodies that validate and accredit the work that you're doing. Essentially, they're providing some accountability for your work and demonstrating to the market that you're not fraudulent. There are carbon projects that don't use carbon standards. They may do that because they've got sufficient trust with buyers. For example, I know one which is a Christian project, and it sells mostly to churches and to congregations, religious congregations. And I think they don't need a standard, but they would argue, because there's a level of trust there. But I think for most of us, particularly if you want to sell to people who don't know your work, you're going to need a carbon standard to demonstrate trustworthiness. And the standard we use is called Plan Vivo. It's the oldest carbon standard. It's voluntary. It's got nothing to do with the United Nations or with the Paris agreements or with these international level policies. But it happens to be based here in Edinburgh, where I am based. So that's very convenient for me. But the main reason we work with it is that it has this real focus on poverty alleviation and on working with people. Not all of the standards have that. They have different flavors. So this one really, it's a charity. It doesn't make any profits. We also work as a charity, so we're not for profit. Yes, we want to protect the forest, but actually helping local people derive benefits, livelihood benefits from their local environments is critical and a critical part of our philosophy. So what you can see there is just a sketch of the process, and typically a project will last for a minimum of 20 years. They could last for longer than that. And to launch a project will take 1 to 2 years of lots of hard work to get to a project launch, which involves a validation visit by a suitably qualified project validator. So we go with Plan Vivo, and that's because of their focus on communities. Next slide, please. So in order to do this kind of project, there are some things that you need to establish right at the start. First of all, you need to establish carbon benefits. And critically, these are flows of carbon, not stocks. So at the mangrove sites where we work, there are more than 1,500 tons of carbon per hectare. That's a huge amount of carbon. That's much more than, that's probably 10 times what you find in many terrestrial forests. So huge amounts of carbon. However, we are not selling that stock of carbon because it just sits there. What we're selling is changes to the flows of carbon into or out of the atmosphere. So it's flows, not stocks. People often get confused about that. The fact that an ecosystem has large amounts of carbon in it is not enough to qualify it for a voluntary carbon project. Secondly, you need to demonstrate additionality. Is this project going to bring new benefits, new carbon benefits, which would not arise but under business as usual? If your area, for example, is very well protected already, then intervening is not going to make a difference. And so you won't be able to demonstrate additionality. You need to demonstrate to avoid leakage. Leakage in this context means if you protect a forest, for example, or a seagrass meadow, are you simply moving the people who depend on that resource to a neighboring forest or seagrass? And are they just destroying that area instead? So how do you avoid just moving a problem around? Can you secure a market and actually sell credits? It's really interesting to me that many people have invested many millions of pounds in looking at the science, and that, which is interesting, and trying to develop these projects, but they haven't thought necessarily about, well, if you have a project, how do you actually sell the credits? So it's not enough to generate credits. You need an institution, you need an organization that can reach out to buyers, can sell credits to them, and then can use that money to maintain and to support the project. And finally, importantly, how do you avoid moral hazard? I'll come back to that a little bit, but moral hazard could mean many things. For me, perhaps most obviously, if you're selling carbon credits to major fossil fuel interests, then probably we can debate that, but arguably you're part of the problem, not part of the solution. So doing this involves wrestling with those questions around greenwash and moral hazard. Next slide, please. In our project, we do two things in our projects, two main things, which earn carbon credits. The first one is to plant trees. And so we aim to plant around 4,000 mangroves a year in Makoko Pamoja. But the second thing is to protect the existing forest. And as I said, the existing forest has very large amounts of carbon in it. What we know is if you remove the trees, if you cut the trees down, that carbon will be lost. And so forest protection and blue carbon protection more generally is the first and most important priority in these projects. And it's the priority for climate, but it's also the priority for finance, because if you plant a lot of small trees, they will not capture very much carbon for, well, a few years. Trees take time to grow, of course. And so you won't earn large, unless you have a very large area, you will not earn large amounts of money, carbon money, only by tree planting. And so forest protection is a critical part of the model that we use. Thank you. Next slide, please. I mentioned additionality. In our case, what we needed to do to demonstrate that was to show the rate of loss of forests in Kenya. And the slide I'm showing you is one of the maps that we produced from our model, and this is based on satellite data going back about 25 years of forest coverage, mangrove coverage in Kenya. And essentially we produced a model. So there was a fair amount of original science in developing this project. But what that model showed was that most of the forests in south of Kenya would disappear. That it looks like there's a mistake on this slide, that there's no kind of remaining mangrove shown, but that's because all of the mangrove around Mombasa, given those current rates, was due to disappear according to this forest. So it was important for us to do that because mangroves in Kenya, as they are in many countries, perhaps most countries, are legally protected. So technically they are already protected. There's no additionality to say, well, we can't, you can't cut down mangroves. But in reality, they were being lost very fast. And that's because there weren't the resources in the country to help support people to keep their mangroves. Next slide, please. We needed to address leakage, and the main approach that we take there is to plant terrestrial trees. So this is an example of a plantation near the village that people can use for all of those things that they need timber for, that they used to use the mangrove forest for. So this is owned by the village, and it provides a resource that they can sell or take for their own use. Next slide, please. So the name of this original project, which is now about 12 years old, actually, is Makoko Pamoja. That's mangroves together in Swahili. Next slide. And I emphasize that we're interested in flows of carbon here rather than stocks. So the essential carbon calculation involves working out what will happen without your project based on extrapolations of current trends. That's the B line. And what you project will happen with the project. And what you sell is the differences between those two projections on an annual basis. Next slide, please. So some of the science here is fairly straightforward. That doesn't mean it's necessarily easy to do on the ground, but the science itself is straightforward. So we can measure, we can estimate the amount of carbon sitting in the trees using fairly straightforward standard techniques. And we've been doing that for many years. And you can see the line, the data there. What that's showing is forest recovery and growth. So since we initiated this project, essentially we're able to stop people cutting the forest. It was all illegal cutting, but we were able to, well, shades of illegality. So we're able to stop that, and you can see the carbon accumulating above ground. Next slide, please. And this slide shows an even simpler count, which is the count of stumps, cut stumps in the forest. And this is really useful data because it's very easy to collect. And what you'd predict is if people are no longer cutting the forest rapidly, then the stumps that are already there will gradually decompose. And that's what you're seeing in the data there. So these are the kind of data that you report every year to the carbon standard, in our case, Plan Vivo. And that just demonstrates, that's evidence that you're doing what you claim to be doing. Next slide, please. It's a complicated business. I mentioned having to work with many different people, which is a real joy in these projects, but it also makes it complicated. So the point of this slide is really just to present some of that complexity. Lots of partnerships going on, partnerships with the Kenyan government who need to support the project legally, partnerships with a community organization based in the village. And this project is owned by the villagers. So I'm there to assist them, but the Mikoko Pamoja project is legally owned by a community-based organization in Kenya. There's the Plan Vivo Foundation, which is our standard. There's a charity called the Association for Coastal Ecosystem Services, ACES, and that was a charity that I established really in order to allow us to sell. That is the body that sells the carbon and then deals with the money and supports that community organization. So that's a small organization, though it has 2 members of staff now. And you need that infrastructure somebody has to, as I said, somebody has to sell a market and deal with the money. Thank you. Next slide, please. Of course, it's very important to be as clear as possible about money. And at the start, we mentioned that there's a lot of hype about blue carbon. There's a lot of big numbers flying around. But running a project like this, we're quite small scale, and the money in the past certainly has been quite marginal, and we don't make profits from what we do. I'm fortunate enough to be paid by my university, so I'm not paid for it. I'm a volunteer, and many of the people who've worked on this are volunteers, as are the people in Kenya, as are the communities in Kenya. So there are lots of fees that need to be paid there. I guess the most important part of this slide is the community benefits at the bottom. So the model that we operate is after we pay the salaries and the fees that we have to do, what is left goes into a fund that is owned by the community, and the community decides how to spend that money. So that's usually around 25 to 30 or 40% of all the money that we raise through carbon sales goes into this community fund. And people have chosen to spend it on a wide range of different projects, often to do with education and health. Next slide, please. This is what a carbon credit looks like. And that's one of our early supporters, the Earthwatch Institute, a charity that supported the initiation of this work and promised to buy some credits from us, which was very helpful. Next slide, please. So a few project impacts. There are many, many needs in these communities in southern Kenya, particularly around health and education. And so people have chosen to spend their money mostly on those issues. And one of the rules that we have is that whatever money is spent has to be spent for community benefit. It doesn't get spent on individuals. And of course, there are lots of demands and lots of tensions in the community about who should spend the money and who should benefit. But that rule is quite helpful. And in fact, people are very good in these communities, in this society, in coming together and making collective decisions about what priorities they have. And as I say, typically people spend on new school buildings, school books, school furniture, health, water supplies, very important. Next slide, please. I mentioned the moral hazards of offsetting. One of the critiques of offsetting carbon, and it's an important critique in my view, is that does this just provide an excuse for businesses and governments and perhaps individuals to avoid cutting those emissions? And as I said right at the start, the best we can hope for with blue carbon is to deal with 3% of current emissions. So it is not a solution on its own. I think it's incumbent on anybody who's involved in climate finance and particularly carbon offsetting to keep giving the message that we have to take action to cut emissions. And so the people that we as ACES sell to, the companies, the institutions, all of them sign a statement of shared values that confirms that they're on a path to net zero. That means that they have to have credible evidence as a business, for example, that they're cutting emissions. If they just come to us and say, we'd like to buy 1,000 tons of carbon, but that's all we're doing in our sustainability plan, we say, well, thank you very much, but you need to go elsewhere. That's really important for us, and I think for the carbon offsetting movement as a whole, because if we're seen to just be cynically selling to anybody who will buy carbon from us and want to use that as an excuse, then I think that undermines the credibility of the whole idea of carbon offsetting. Next slide, please. This is my final slide. I mentioned at the start that mangroves, seagrass, and salt marsh are the traditional, if you like, the well-known blue carbon ecosystems. Some of you may be aware that there's lots of discussion about other possible blue carbon ecosystems. So I speak to people who say, well, are whales blue carbon? Whales have lots of carbon in them. Does that mean and they live in the ocean, does that mean they're blue carbon? So marine megafauna, kelp has become very attractive. That's a form of seaweed. Just mud, sediments. So all of these things are being talked about. However, in order to make them practical as sources of finance for conservation and for livelihoods, you need a firm scientific footing. And in particular, you need to show that it's really proper sequestration. That means that the carbon that's captured by these ecosystems stays away from the atmosphere for a matter of years, decades to centuries to millennia. So based on that, mangroves are by far the best known and secure blue carbon ecosystems. Seagrass we know quite a lot about, as we do salt marsh. The other, I would really caution people to be careful if people come and say, look, is seagrass a blue carbon, or are whales blue carbon? My answer is no. There's some scientific debate about that, but there's certainly large amounts of uncertainty about those. So thank you for listening to me. I apologize for the technical problems early on. And I guess my key take-home messages from this presentation are, it's true, the hype about blue carbon is true in the sense that blue carbon ecosystems are extremely powerful nature-based solutions or nature-based contributions to climate mitigation. However, in the context of the total carbon emissions in the planet, it's quite small, so we have to remain aware of that. The carbon market can work for local communities and for conservation, but it needs really careful partnership and careful working with others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark. That was very, very interesting. And in addition to taking us through some of the practical elements of developing a blue carbon project, you also kind of situated it in a realistic context around what it can do and what it can't do in the larger climate change fight and also the financing of conservation. We're going to take questions right away, actually, in the interest of time. So you can put those in the chat box if you prefer, or you can just raise your hand and we can take them with you taking the floor and asking that question. So we'll first take one from Lucy. She's placed it in the chat. In the Mikoko Promerja project, a charity, ACES, deals with the management, marketing, and development. 2 questions. Do community projects always need an external partner to help in developing the project and marketing the carbon? And the second, is it common for a charity to take this role, or is it more common for a commercial project developer to step in? And when it's a commercial project developer, what cut of the income do they typically take?
Thanks, Lucy. That's a great question. If you work with Plan Vivo as your carbon standard, then one of their rules is that at least 60% of the income that is earned by the sale of carbon needs to return to the site. What that means is that at least 60% of the money that you earn needs to, for example, support local employment, the running of the project on site, those community benefits and so on. So what that means is you've got a maximum of 40% of the intake left for whoever is doing the sales and marketing and so on. In our projects, because as I said, I'm fortunate that I get paid by university and I can do this on the side, as it were. So we've been fortunate to have lots of voluntary options, and we also started very small. So Mikoko Promerja only has 117 hectares, which is really small. That was a deliberate decision because we wanted to discover whether we could do this work. In hindsight, I wish we had a larger area because that would have made the finances easier. So if there are commercial partners, I think the answer to your question depends. I'm reluctant to give a generic answer because it depends critically on the area that you're dealing with and the amount of carbon benefits. It also, of course, depends on the price that you're able to demand for carbon credits, and that varies a lot between projects. $20 a ton is quite a good price that we might sell. Sometimes we get higher prices than that. Sometimes we sell for less. We don't, as I said, we're quite choosy about who we sell to. So that means we don't always sell to the highest bidder. Some projects would command a higher price. Our price is quite high, I think, in the market, though, compared to other projects. And that's because people are interested in supporting the wider social benefits of the work we do. They're not looking for the cheapest possible, ton of carbon. So I'm evading your question a little bit, but it depends critically on the carbon standard that you're working with, and their rules about community benefit and the size and scope of the project that you're contemplating.
Thank you. We'll next go to Nilanthi and then go to Krishani. So Nilanthi, over to you first.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Nilanthi Komudini from Ministry of Environment, Director Endowment Planning and Economics. Currently, we are working with the RCC Dubai for preparation of the carbon trading framework for Sri Lanka, framework and guiding principles. So actually, my question is that thank you very much for the presentation. It is very good presentation, comprehensive, and all the details are there. But thing is that in Sri Lankan context, I think if a voluntary carbon market project is going to be started, then the first thing we have to look at the who has the ownerships of the land. Then because then to implement this kind of project, it is needed to get the approval from the relevant agencies or owners. If private owners, anyhow, their approval is much in essential factor to implement this kind of project, especially when it comes to mangrove. And then actually these are my comments, and then we have to look at what are the NDC's targets in the country, because if the proposed mangrove project is already come under the NDC targets that government committed to the Paris Agreement, then again voluntary market, I think then again it is not possible to implement this kind of project for carbon selling. And at what point I have a question about that in Article 6 Paris Rule Book, there's a need to establishing authorizing entity in each country for carbon transactions. When it comes to authorizing, actually depending on the end purpose of using these credit, if these credit used for the achievement of NDCs in another country or other international mitigation activities, then it should be happen in the way of ITMO transfer, and then these credit will be credited back to the country as their emissions. So these are my comments. So I would like to have your comments on these things.
Thank you, Dinanthi. Mark, would you like to take that before we move to the next question? I think that's a very timely, practical question from a government official who has to, who's involved in kind of setting up the framework and dealing with this international level.
Sorry, I missed a bit of that. Anushka, were you asking me to pause before I came back?
No, I think if you can respond to that question first before we take the next one. I was originally thinking we'll take a few, but I think this was a very important one that might need a good comprehensive answer first.
Yes, thanks, Dinanthi. So those are really, I agree, really important and quite difficult questions. I heard three different questions there. One of your questions was about additionality. So if your site is already part, for example, of a national restoration plan, does that mean that by definition you can't demonstrate additionality if you were a project developer? The answer to that is not necessarily. So in Kenya, for example, as I said, the mangroves were already legally protected, and they already formed part of national management plans by the Kenya Forest Service. However, it was very easy to demonstrate on the ground that the management and the protection was not happening. And that's because for lots of reasons, but mainly because the resources were not there in country. So you might have areas that are technically de jure in law are protected or are part of national plans, but which in practice you can demonstrate are hello. I'm hoping I'm still with you. We're cut or something.
Yep, we can see you. Wow. We lost you for a moment, but we can see you.
That was the additionality question. you also asked about ownership, which is critical. So people do not necessarily have to own the mangrove, but they have tenureship of it. And so in Kenya, again, the government owns the forest, which means you have to work, of course, with the government, the owner, but it's possible under Kenyan law for people to have legal tenureship of forest products, including carbon. That's a mechanism, a legal mechanism, which is common in many, certainly in African countries that I'm familiar with. I know in Sri Lanka, there were lots of, I haven't worked there for a while, unfortunately. I'd love to work there again, but I know there were lots of problems or questions around ownership of coastal areas, and even establishing who owned abandoned shrimp ponds and so on can be challenging. So you're right, that's a critical issue. You need to show that you have legal tenureship to areas to run one of these kinds of projects. On the Article 6 question, on a global front, nobody knows. I think governments are really struggling with this, and they're coming up with in my experience, very different approaches to how they might integrate small-scale, voluntary, community-based projects with national plans. And in some countries, it's simply impossible. I know in Malaysia, for example, at the moment, you can't do it for that reason. In other countries like Kenya, you can. The government's open to negotiation and to using NGOs and others to help build up their national picture. And they're still debating how they deal with double counting, whether those credits will count towards their NDCs or not. So that's an open question, and it varies, in my experience, from country to country.
Thank you, Mark. Nilanthi will connect you also over email with Mark in case you have any further questions so that you can take them forward. We'll now move to Krishani.
Thank you.
Sure. Krishani, go ahead. You can ask your question.
Thank you. Mark, thank you very much for the very insightful presentation. And actually, part of my question was answered already. It's around additionality. But what one more thing I would like to know is that the fact that an already protected land, but in reality, in ground reality, it's not really protected. So in this case, that the additionality is still there. The factor of additionality is still there. Is this something special to Plan Vivo, or is this common around other registries like Gold Standards and Vera? So this is one of my other questions that was not answered. So I'd really like to know a bit more if this is registry specific, or is this common around all registries?
I'm not an expert on Gold Standard or Vera, although I think, as far as Vera is concerned, I think it's common in Vera too. Most of the world's mangroves, for example, many of them are legally protected, and that's not stopping. That fact is not stopping the initiation of lots of activity in mangroves. So I think it's common. Clearly, it could be abused as a loophole, and so I can speak for Plan Vivo, with, as I say, whom I think are a great organisation, and we really enjoy working with them. They fit well with our ethos. They have a technical committee that will look in great detail at your evidence for additionality. And so it's not enough simply to say, well, this law is not well enforced. You need evidence for it. But in my experience, yes, what I'm saying is I suspect it is common to other standards.
Okay, until we have any others either raising their hand to raise a question from the floor or putting it in the chat. Mark, I had a quick question to ask you around the use of the proceeds from the sale of blue carbon credits. I noticed in the list of things that the community organization spends on, some of them are social needs and mangrove restoration. So ecosystem protection, ecosystem rehabilitation was one of many. It wasn't the primary purpose. Is that impression correct, that it is very much up to the community on what they would use? So that's one question. And the other is, in that case, does that mean then that, say, the Forest Service needs to also keep continuing to finance the protection of mangroves, mangrove restoration, mangrove planting and maintenance, and so on? Because sometimes we have the impression here in Sri Lanka that this blue carbon credit is a possible complete solution to plugging big holes in conservation finance of a protected area.
Thank you, Anushka. On the second point around the contribution of the Forest Service, I think that relates perhaps a little bit to the Article 6 discussion and how governments across the world are thinking about integrating the different markets, the voluntary market and the compliance market, and their national targets. So in some countries where the Forest Service is well funded and well organised, they are responsible and are capable of doing that kind of management. In most of the places where I've been working, essentially we're performing those functions. So although on paper, mangrove conservation, restoration, community engagement, all of those things happen under the aegis of the Forest Service, in practice that doesn't occur. And so we're able to bring the funds and help the government achieve that, help the Forest Service achieve that. A major conversation, that's an important conversation that's been having in most countries, is around the rent or the tax that governments may or may not take from these kinds of projects. Because we were a demonstration project when we started, and we were very small, we actually don't pay any kind of tax to the Kenyan government. And the Kenyan government has been supportive and quite happy to use us as an example in their COP demonstrations and so on. So that's been useful for them. Going forward, they are looking at what kind of tax they might extract, and certainly larger terrestrial projects are paying tax. In Tanzania, the government there is talking about a 75% take, which would destroy our project. It would be impossible for small-scale projects. So that's a really important political conversation that's happening, at different rates in different countries. You talked about the community benefit, and yes, that's from the perspective of local people. If we were not able to demonstrate benefits to local people from this activity, the project would have failed very rapidly. So people in this area have seen many projects come and go, development projects come and go. Many of them have failed, often because there's initiation funding, sometimes quite large amounts of funding that last for 2 or 3 years, and then it just finishes without people seeing obvious benefits. And if I can just share an anecdote. In fact, the reason I got involved in this was because I was confronted by villagers in Ghazi after working there for 8 years on mangrove conservation, and they were saying, well, where are the benefits for us? And that was an important experience for me because I hadn't seen it from their perspective. And so I had to think, that's what made me think really hard. How can I bring money to these people? So it's critical that those communities have benefits. And of course, it varies. The amount of benefits varies between different communities. People there are poor, and so small amounts of money can make really big difference. That probably wouldn't work in Australia, so it depends on the social context.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to take another question that you put on the chat. Maybe you also can see it. One of the issues Sri Lanka faces in registering a community-based project is the strenuous auditing process and the costs associated with UN or gold standards. Is it the same with Plan Vivo, and how did projects like Mikoko Pamoja overcome these challenges during the inception?
So it is the same in the sense that you can't avoid, if you go for a carbon standard, you can't avoid some of those costs because you have to demonstrate proper due process. However, Plan Vivo, I think, is less onerous in the technical requirements. And so it has this higher focus, as I said, on community benefit compared to some of the other standards. And the trade-off there is that it probably demands a little bit less in terms of the precision of your carbon measurements, for example. I think that's entirely appropriate because, in fact, a lot of that precision is spurious. We know this, it's very hard to estimate exactly what carbon you're having. However, it's relatively straightforward to demonstrate that saving these ecosystems and expanding them will bring carbon benefits. So Plan Vivo tends to take a conservative assumption. It allows you to use some conservative assumptions about your science, and then allows you to focus on really having a well-trusted and embedded project. So yes, it's a little bit cheaper, I think, than Vera. It also allows much smaller projects to establish than some of the other standards. And the way we managed this was, I guess it's about partnership. So I was able to tap into funds, for example, that funded the science. As a scientist, I was able to get science funding, research funding to help with this. I was also able to bring volunteers, including students. And there is a lot of goodwill. That's not going to always work on a countrywide level, but for these relatively smaller projects, I've discovered that people are they're very keen. They want to work on things that are helping. That's both here in Scotland, but in country as well, in Kenya or in Gambia. I think it's hard to scale that, but it's a nice way of working because it's more sustainable. People are invested in it.
Mark, before I hand over to Lucy to give some closing thoughts and also ask any questions you might have, I have one final question around risks and reputational risk particularly. There are many partners in the example you gave and perhaps in any other typical project or transaction of this nature. We've seen in recent times that some of these auditing and accreditation, carbon auditing accreditation firms have been called out for shoddy accreditation, for greenwashing, and then automatically country projects get highlighted, sometimes unfortunately giving those a bad name. So when you think of the different players involved, who really takes on much of this reputational risk around making sure these are good, credible projects that aren't cutting corners and just trying to get some quick cash generated from an environmental asset or natural capital?
Thank you. What a great question. The critical player there is the standard, and I have my own views about the relative values of the different standards. As I say, my experience with Plan Vivo has been very good, and I think their ethos is exactly right, and it really helps that they're a charity, so their interest is not to make money. I'm not saying that commercial bodies, I'm not saying it would be impossible to make money in an ethical way from this, but I guess it helps if the profit motive is not part of the equation. I think so. It's the standard that's critical. But I also think that the sellers, I think we all have a responsibility here. And for any of us, it's easy to get, I'm very passionate about mangroves. I love mangrove forests. I think they're great ecosystems. And as a biologist, I'm still in awe when I'm in a mangrove. It's my happy place. We have nothing like mangroves up here in Scotland, and they're just fantastic ecosystems. So I'm very enthusiastic about them. And of course, I want to do what I can to promote them and conserve them. But that's why I have to be a little bit cautious about suggesting that they're going to solve our climate crisis, for example. And sometimes I hear that kind of language coming from scientists and others, and I think we need to be cautious about that. So I think it's incumbent on scientists to take some responsibility, and finally on sellers too. As I say, it's quite a strange position to be marketing a product but to be examining our buyers before we sell to them. But that's effectively what we do. And we just turn people down. We say, well, no, we're not, we won't sell to you because the reputational risk is too high. And so that doesn't ensure that we won't suffer reputational damage, but we have to be careful about it.
I think we have one more question from the floor, but just before I get to that, Mark, I had a quick follow-up question because you talked about people like yourself, scientists, biologists. There's some sense in the science community here, a fear that if they go ahead and calculate some of the carbon sequestration potential in some of our sites, that's just going to lead to the commercialization of it and the selling of carbon credits willy-nilly. What would you say to biologists, scientists who might have that concern or worry that therefore they shouldn't, reveal what these carbon sequestration values are?
The short answer is we should always reveal our findings in science. We should share information, and it's not the response. If you're sticking to the scientific process of doing your best to make those estimates, then you're fulfilling your duties as a scientist. That's not the same as then taking the next step and involving yourself in actually organizing projects and selling carbon, which is what I've done. That brings additional responsibilities. But I would say scientists have to do their best to make legitimate estimates, and that's their job, and to share that information always.
Thank you, Mark. Over to you. I can't see who that is. Maybe it's Professor Sewang, is it?
Hi, yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much for the really interesting presentation. I just have one simple question. We've been using the word we in talking about selecting to whom you will be selling your credits. What do you mean by we here? Is that the community plus a set of experts that have been gathered together to decide? I'm just very curious to find out who is in that we. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question, and it's a short answer. So the charity ACES that takes the responsibility of marketing and selling the credits, that's the body that has made these decisions. Of course, we've shared those decisions with our other partners in these projects, including the communities, but we think it's our responsibility to be really clear about those processes of marketing and sales. So the charity is run with a board of trustees. Those people have relevant expertise, and it's something that we discuss a great deal, and of course report here to the charity regulator in Scotland. So it's that body that does the administration and the sales and the marketing.
Thank you so much, Mark. Before I close, maybe I'll ask Lucy for any quick reflections she might have, particularly around takeaways on how Sri Lanka can think about this in the context of conservation finance, where we're trying to push in our work together with BRT, not just looking at those national debt instruments linked to nature, which are being highlighted quite a lot, but also initiatives that could generate some financing for projects at a local level. Lucy, any final words before we close?
And maybe just before that, just to say, it's great to speak to friends in Sri Lanka, and I've always really enjoyed working in country. So please do feel free to get in touch. If I can help, I'm always looking for those opportunities. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just really briefly, I think that was so interesting. It's come at such an interesting time in Sri Lanka, as many well, maybe not many, but as some really innovative blue carbon projects are being planned and talked about. And I guess my take-home messages were sort of two. I think one, I don't want to misrepresent you, Mark. I'd never do that, of course. But as I understood it, the real challenge, it seems to be more to do with sort of governance and organisation and stakeholder engagement and equity and ethics, not so much the technical validation and verification and monitoring, you know, the MRV and the calculations. Yes, those are important, but maybe that's not the real binding constraint. And the other thing I found really refreshing, and I didn't realize we were going to get this, and I think it's brilliant, is that, you know, most of these community-based voluntary carbon projects, whether terrestrial or mangroves, are, you know, absolutely fantastic, but they're very much by the book, and they're very much seeking to maximize sales and maximize income in an equitable, distributional way. And what my other take-home message that I really really appreciated was, you know, what you're doing is a little bit of a maverick, a little bit of a radical in being so choosy about how you generate carbon credits and who you sell them to. And that was a real take-home message to me that I'd never really thought about before, but of course so critical. If we're talking about ethical, equitable, community-led, community benefiting schemes, how can we not be a little bit choosy about how we behave and how we engage in the market? That was a real take-home message. So yeah, I am certainly inspired. Now we just have to think, Anush, how we can get Mark over to Sri Lanka again. So back to you, Anush, to close up, or whoever's closing up, Tashi.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And yes, Mark, we'll certainly find ways to bring you over. As Lucy said, it's a very interesting time. A lot of excitement around it, a lot of international groups and investors keen, but I think Sri Lanka has to be mindful about doing these right and not be a new place to experiment for good reasons and for credible reasons, not for the wrong reasons. And hopefully through sessions like this and your talk today, we've got a better understanding of what to look out for in terms of both the potential but also the pitfall. We will leave you with that. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. I know we tried to organize this even earlier. You've been very generous with your time. Thank you, and we'll certainly find ways to bring you out here to Sri Lanka. And thank you for everyone who joined us. If you would like to hear more about the session that's happening on Monday, that goes into some of the Sri Lankan perspectives. One is an actual scientist who's done some assessment around carbon stock, and also someone who's involved in developing a project, as well as a private sector investor perspective. We have that on Monday. If there's folks who are new to this and would like to attend, please drop Tasha and I a message. And thank you very much to everyone for joining. Mark, thank you once again.